Hello everyone, my name's Antonio Fletcher and I'm joined by my colleague Louise Purcell for our first employment team podcast of the year in 2023. Just looking ahead to some of the things to expect, some of the challenges, and having a chat through where the world of employment law is at the moment. So thank you for joining me, Louise, today.
It's okay.
I think it's fair to say we've certainly had a strange few years that have impacted the way we work and employment practices quite a lot. Thinking of not only the COVID pandemic, but also factors like Brexit that have really shaken up the workforce.
Absolutely. And now inflation.
And now inflation as well, cost of living crisis, with people struggling to pay their bills, which has led to, I think, a lot of the strike action that we've seen in the last couple of months as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think one of the sort of hangovers, if you like, from the pandemic is obviously the new way that we all work, and it seems that employers are transitioning a bit at the moment from the home working hybrid situation we've had in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think things are never going to be the same, really, are they? You know, we've all got used to working from home at least some of the time. And I think it's probably going to be with us now permanently.
Yeah, I certainly think it's one of those things that everyone expects. I think candidates looking for roles, probably the second question they ask after how much will I get paid is how many days can I work from home, and I think we've definitely transitioned to that mentality, which has its own challenges at times for employers, and particularly those that might want to adapt things going forward. And I think it's fair to say that actually there are more changes on the way, but certainly potentially, that will be more burdensome or for employers and potentially give employees more rights. Do you want to tell us a bit about those?
Yes, so we've got a few things on the horizon. Firstly, there are going to be fairly significant increases to the living wage and minimum wage rates just coming up in April. Obviously, in the face of inflation, they're going up quite a bit.
Yes.
And for employers, particularly those who employ a lot of sort of more junior staff, that's going to be quite a thing coming up.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond those that are simply earning that level of pay to I've certainly heard mentioned, for example, in schools that now let's say roles that were traditionally lesser paid, like let's say cleaners or lunchtime supervisors, this increase in minimum wage will take them above or very much in line with the earnings of someone like a teaching assistant. So you then have a knock-on effect where you're either going to be faced with a situation where different levels of roles that might have been paid in a different way traditionally are either now going to be the same, or a further impact in costs where you're going to have to increase everyone's wages to maintain that differentiation. So it seemed to me quite burdensome on employers, that extra cost, particularly when they're facing extra costs all over the place.
Absolutely. I suppose no one really expected inflation to be where it is now. We haven't seen it for a long time. And so, yeah, it's going to mean that protection actually helps lots of sort of more junior employees, but leaves employers with the headache of, you know, how to deal with issues that might arise with those who traditionally have earned more than minimum wage.
Yeah.
Whose incomes aren't protected in the same way.
In the same way, yes. And I think there's a few other things on the horizon in terms of bills that are working their way through Parliament that may enhance rights. I think flexible working was one area where I think the consultation closed just at the end of the year, that we may see changes maybe later this year with enhanced rights for flexible working.
Yeah, do you think that's going to make a big difference?
It'd be interesting to see, actually, because the core changes are really that it becomes a day one right to request flexible working rather than having to have been in employment for a while. And then secondly, the fact that individuals can make 2 flexible working requests in a year rather than 1. So how many people will, let's say, be gutsy enough to make a flexible working request that early on in their working life with a new employer, or repeat ones?
Yeah, it's always a difficult one to navigate, isn't it, when you're a new employee?
Yes.
Yeah, but at least you'll have the protection now.
Yes, at least there will be that protection, and then a few enhanced family-friendly rights that, I mean, taking a cynical view, you might think, is the government trying to pick up votes from people by introducing things that might look quite popular, particularly for, let's say, those people in sort of in employment in relatively high earning jobs or higher earning jobs that might benefit from this.
Possibly it's part of trying to increase productivity, wanting, as much of the working age population back at work.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a factor. I think with the crisis in the employment market, the need for the economy to grow, the need to maximise our employment market really is crucial, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's where we're talking about sort of additional protection for individuals who are either pregnant or have returned from maternity leave. So getting some of the protection that you get whilst you're on maternity leave around redundancy, and then extra leave for things like fertility appointments, extra leave where children are in neonatal care. Which will all be seen, hopefully those will benefit quite a lot of people.
But you wonder in practice, I mean, most people who have babies who are in neonatal care, presumably they would probably, on the whole, be on maternity leave anyway at that time.
Yeah. Might be one for the dads, though, as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. But question how big an impact it's really having.
Yeah.
It certainly sets the right tone, though.
Yeah, it sort of sets the tone for let's call it a government that wants to look after people, maybe. I mean, it's also fair to say that some of the changes actually that the government are talking about implementing do counterbalance that somewhat, and there's been lots of talk now about the minimum service levels and the legislation that's being discussed at the moment about setting minimum service levels when strikes are called. So that would effectively be preventing some people who may have voted and may have wanted to strike from striking.
Absolutely. I think it's mainly sort of public sector, isn't it?
Yeah.
That one.
So it's sort of maintaining those, I guess, the crucial services, but that will impact employers as well. Sort of transport being one, and the need to maintain certain levels of transport, and then of course the most unpopular and probably uncertain one, the retained EU law revocation and reform bill, which is very snappily named. But did you want to talk about that a bit?
I mean, I suppose we're now in this situation where following Brexit, there is potentially, it's all open and the government can, if they want, depart from legislation which currently is in place because of Europe. I imagine it's going to be a massive headache when they're looking at, exactly going through everything. What shall we keep? What shall we get rid of, etc. And I think, the uncertainty that it's going to cause for case law and precedent and how that works, it's going to be quite a headache for those reviewing it, for judges deciding the law, and potentially a lot more uncertainty moving forwards over the next few years.
Yeah, and that uncertainty, in essence, it does bring about more litigation, more conflict in the workplace, and from our perspective, one might argue it's a good thing because there will be more developments in case law, and that will tend to have a knock-on effect on the work that you and I do. But from an employee's perspective, the risk is, and this was the risk that was highlighted all along when this bill was announced. There's a lot of rights that individuals have and perhaps take for granted now derive from that law and may simply be stripped out altogether. There needs to be a proactive step to reintroduce them.
Very much so.
Which with some rights, there'll probably be more appetite to do that than others. I think it's fair to say that the general consensus on whether this is a good thing or a bad is a little mixed. It's that there are areas where I think, particularly putting an employer's hat on, some deregulation might be beneficial. Thinking of things like the agency worker regs, some of the holiday entitlement case law that's developed over the years.
Has become very complex, hasn't it?
It has become very
even
complex.
For employment lawyers to navigate.
Yeah, we have fun with that every now and again. It does follow this line that was promoted, I think, throughout the Brexit campaign of removing red tape. Now, if it's removing red tape, I think it will have an element of support behind it. But if it does become sort of the stripping of core rights that people do rely on, then I think it will turn into a much less popular thing. Let's put it that way.
And there's likely to be a backlash in that situation.
Yeah, and there is likely to be that backlash. And you mentioned earlier the risk of uncertainty and the risk of litigation. Do you want to mention what the tribunal system looks like at the moment?
Absolutely. There are big delays in the tribunal system. I think things started to go a bit wrong because of the pandemic. The tribunals were shut for months. Most hearings were, some of them going ahead on the telephone, but they very quickly had to move over to doing remote hearings, and they just weren't keeping up with demand. And so I think there's a backlog that's continued, really. They haven't really made any headway. I think there is quite a big recruitment exercise, isn't there, with judges being taken on. But potentially recently the levels of claim have been quite low.
Yeah.
So if they're struggling to keep up with that, one wonders what will happen if there is indeed a recession, and following recessions we normally get an influx of claims.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw one interesting stat from our local tribunals user group, knows, that suggested that in the middle, well, it would have been the third quarter of last year, that there were significantly more claims going into the system than the tribunal was able to dispose of. And as you say, it's not been the busiest time for claims at the moment. People have generally either found a way of resolving disputes via settlement, or people simply haven't brought claims because they've gone into new employment very quickly thereafter.
Because of the way the market is
Because of the way the market's been now. Now, if that were to change, and if there is extra uncertainty around law and legal rights and things like that in future, it's very hard to see how the tribunal could continue to provide an effective service without very significant additional resource, which, again, looking at the greater public sector picture at the moment and all the problems that there are, it's very hard to see where that resource would come from.
Absolutely. Yeah, you just really wonder where that will take us. Yeah. And also, I think, this introduction that we've had since COVID of remote hearings, that's making quite a big impact on the way things work. Once you do actually get to a hearing, often now you're having that hearing by video link, a bit like a Teams call. So you have the barrister in one place, the clients, the witnesses in other places, and the judge somewhere else again. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I think I'm with the majority in saying it's probably not providing the same level of access to justice as a normal hearing would. Clearly, it had great advantages during the pandemic because it allowed things to carry on, which otherwise would have ground to a complete halt and we'd be in even more of a mess now. But the difficulty is that it's just hard to see how that can be sustainable for any length of time, and simply whether people view that in the same way as they would view going to a hearing and being heard in person by a judge in a tribunal room.
Yeah.
So there's a perception element as well.
Very much so. Possibly you don't feel you've had your say and feel you've been heard properly. Yeah.
And I do sympathise with tribunals a lot, because certainly a remote hearing is better than no hearing, and the strain that tribunals are under, where there's still seemingly an issue with judge availability, causing hearings to be postponed on the day or very shortly before they're due to begin. Now that has all kinds of implications, because if you're waiting 2 years for a hearing date and then that hearing date doesn't even happen, you may then find yourself waiting a whole other year just to have the hearing.
Absolutely, plus 2 sets of fees potentially, because once your barrister is ready and briefed, then you have to usually pay their fees, or at least some element of them.
Yeah, there will be no doubt be a cost implication. There will also be obviously a time implication for a business, particularly if we're talking about a small business. That may be key individuals taken out of their day job to prepare for a hearing that then doesn't go ahead.
And then they can't remember because it's so long ago since events.
Memories fade, I think it's fair to say. And actually people do leave organisations as well. So people who might have been witnesses may have moved on by the time that a hearing goes to tribunal. So you're then facing another set of problems in making sure that those people still attend and give their evidence. So again, that impacts on the justice that's being dished out to a certain extent.
Absolutely, and traditionally the whole point of a tribunal was that everything moved pretty quickly.
Yeah.
You would usually be at the tribunal within months. You have to put your claim in within 3 months, which compared to other areas of law is actually very, very fast moving, isn't it?
It is. It was supposed to be a fairly informal, quick way of resolving issues when we look back sort of 25 years ago to when the tribunals were set up in their current form. I think it's fair to say a lot of those boxes are not being ticked at the moment.
No, I think potentially there is a place for remote hearings, possibly if it's something very straightforward, a wages claim, some money hasn't been paid or something. But once you're into the realms of unfair dismissal and discrimination, whistleblowing, I think you very much need to be there in person. That would be my preference. Yes,
no, I think that's right, and hopefully that can be a way that the tribunals use the remote hearing system more effectively going forward.
Very much so.
But I think it's fair to say we've got a year ahead where it's difficult to predict a lot of what will happen at this moment in time, but we'll probably see some interesting developments along the way.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's a continuation of the uncertainty we've had over the last few years. Yeah, really.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you everyone for listening to this podcast, and wish you all the best for the year ahead.
Thank you.